prison for 27 years for advocating armed struggle, remembered as a kind of grandfatherly teddy bear. Like, why this erasure? What's at stake when our schools teach us or don't teach us this real history, right? That's a big question. Because, I mean, think about it. If everybody knew that about King, one, there wouldn't be a national holiday. But two, right, when it comes time to enacting social change today, if you don't know that about King, if you don't know that this is the politics that he embodied, then you wouldn't be thinking about that yourself. Today, when it comes to Iraq or Afghanistan or other places that the U.S. has intervened on. And of course, maybe for us in this room, we're more aware of that because that's quote unquote our part of the world. But think about it for black youth. If black youth knew that King and Malcolm made these kinds of connections, then in their politics, they might be able to make those kinds of connections today. But because they don't know that necessarily, right, they're not thinking in those ways. I've talked to many people. Some people, I mean, it's give and take. I've heard different things. But obviously we know with the Ferguson protests, for example, there's a lot of solidarity that happened in Palestine, in Gaza in particular, right? A lot of connections were being made through social media and whatnot. But I know many people who went to Ferguson, and the young activists there who are making these connections, and this is, talking to some people, they actually think they're doing something new by making the connection between, like, say, here and there. They actually think this is something different. Wow, this is a new way to think about politics. They have no concept that this has been done as part of the black radical tradition, and even someone like King. So if we don't know what was done in the past, we won't know what to do now. We'll contain our own way of thinking about the world, right? So that's what's at stake, right? It's another way of kind of like revising or rewriting history to narrow what we think is possible today. And so you asked another more important question, Nabil, what can we do about it? Well, I think first and foremost, spread the word. Tell people about this history. Read yourself. Educate yourself on this, right? And then continue to talk to people about it. And then in the kind of social circles or activist spaces that you're involved in, continue to think along these same lines, if you agree with them. You might not agree with those positions, right? But I think it's important, again, to understand it. I mean, I'm a firm believer, like, if you don't know the rules of the game, you're not going to win, right? If you don't know how the game is played, you're not going to win, right? And I say this again, this is one of my favorite TV shows, one of my favorite shows of all time is The Wire, right? And they would also, it's chess, not checkers, right? If the game is played, this is chess that's being played out here, not checkers, right? And so when we think about why these kinds of histories are erased, right? We have to understand that there's an agenda here, and we have to do our best to fight that agenda. And it's not just with Malcolm and Martin. It comes out of our own histories, wherever we may come from, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Pakistan, Afghanistan, wherever the case it may be that we come from. There are histories that are silenced that we don't know about. Even in Islamic history, there are histories that we don't know about. Narratives that have been written out by this thing that now we call tradition. Now we look back on tradition and think it's just some solid thing. Well, maybe there were some things that happened that were pushed out of the tradition that might have been good to know about. It might help us today, right? So we should always be critical of orthodoxy, no matter where it comes from. And it's incumbent upon all of us to educate ourselves as a result. So I hope I answered your question. Yeah? All right, cool. Anybody else have questions? Don't be afraid. All right, you go ahead.
So, my name is and as a student activist, as a Muslim American, I've been really, thinking about how to, I guess, challenge the social power that's in power right now, I guess. And how to combat it. I mean, I hope I'm getting my question across, but we've seen all these civil rights struggles happen. We've seen a lot of these protests and whatnot happen. And as John Lennon said that a couple of days ago, that Selma is now.
Right.
But I feel like a lot of times that these protests and these movements that we're trying to push for, they're not either being heard or they're not being changed, because there's those people in power that don't want to listen to us just because the system is built that within the system, I guess, in my opinion, I feel like it doesn't work. And so how do we go about changing the system? How do we go about fixing it?
I mean, it's a big question. Look, I'm an old man. Relative. But like I said, history, our tradition tells us, Malcolm told, history is our best teacher. Look at it today, right? And even amongst the stuff around Ferguson, there's a gatekeeping class of black intelligentsia, Sharpton, and a whole host of others who are telling the kind of Black Lives Matter folks and the Ferguson protesters, don't do this, don't do that, or dismissing them, not allowing them into certain spaces, right? Not allowing them to speak on platforms and whatnot. Sharpton's telling people not to march, not to do certain things, right? There's a deep kind of generational, if you will, divide, but I don't want to make it just about old people and young people. It's about strategy and tactics, right? This is not new. This is not new, right? The famous moment when Stokely Carmichael declares, "We want black power," he's on a march with Dr. King. The young upstarts in SNCC saw King and civil rights as like, we don't agree with that. We want to do something different. And of course, King was trying to contain it. King was very smart strategically, and he didn't want to be associated with people who were seen at that period of his career as too radical. That would alienate his followers and the people who were looking, right? Because King was seen as too radical and dangerous, they wouldn't deal with him. So there's always been gatekeepers, then, now. It could be generational, but it could be about strategy and tactics. And as we know in our community, it's no different. There's gatekeepers here who are telling us, this is how we have to do our politics. This is the way engagement works. This is what it means to be political. Right? You go rub elbows with the powerful, you award the police, you give Homeland Security a blueprint for how to police the Muslim community and tell them that you, as a Muslim organization, will do it for them. This is COINTELPRO 2.0. For those of you who don't know what COINTELPRO is, look it up. Right? There's many problems with this. One, if we're sitting here arguing for rights, how arrogant of us to think that we know how to do it. Black people have been doing this country for a long time. And if you don't care about non-Muslim black people, then look at black Muslims. And look what they've done. There's a model here. Look at their successes, look at their failures, learn from it. But no, we just think we know what's up. And then we step in, and in many ways, make matters worse. We give and reinvigorate the state to police us. But now we have Muslims doing it to other Muslims. So we're having it today. We're in the same place that, in many ways, not in the same place, but relative to a gatekeeping class that, say, Malcolm was with civil rights, and young upstart black radicals were with establishment civil rights. We want a different way of doing things, I would hope. Right? And so we have to think very creatively of how to do that. And there's many movements that are doing it. BDS is just one example of making certain kinds of connections. Just one, right? Example of doing that, right? And there's going to be others that emerge, right? But it's incumbent upon us to come up with new ways to do things. The old way won't work. They will tell you, because they told me that I'm impractical. And my question back to them is, well, wait a minute. I'm impractical? If civil rights worked, why is it, based on all the stats that I didn't actually give you the stats, but if black people are at or worse than they were before, what good is civil rights? Actually, you're impractical. You're hitting your head up against the same wall that failed black freedom. That's impractical. You got to think about something new. We have to think differently, and I think we are in a position, right? Many of us in a somewhat privileged position, but we are in a position now, in a very volatile time, right? Where if we don't take this seriously, Chapel Hill might seem like an exception to some of you, but it's going to become a very different kind of America. as it relates to us very soon if we don't really organize politically in the right way. You know, I think it's really important for us to think about that deeply. You know, I'll stop and say that there. I don't want to say too much, right? Any other questions? Comments, thoughts? Go ahead.
What would you say was Malcolm's vision strategically? So where did he expect to see the fruits of having this black identity, understanding the history? Where did he expect that to go, let's say, 20, 30 years down the line? Is that something that we know?
I mean, there's a lot of projections. I mean, you know, he comes back and forms an Organization of African Unity for African American Unity based on Kwame Nkrumah's Organization of African Unity, right? But he wants it for black people, regardless of religious affiliation. You don't have to be a Muslim to be a part of the OAAU. But then he also forms Muslim Mosque Incorporated for Muslims, right? Now his big life project, or the end of his life, was internationalizing the struggle of black people. So he goes to Cairo, Egypt, at the big OAU meeting, where 34 heads of states of the African continent are there. Nasser is there and introduces Malcolm, and meets with him, and Malcolm makes the case to these 34 heads of state about how the United States is tricking you thinking that the civil rights bill that's about to pass, and this was 64, and the 64 and 65 bills hadn't passed yet. But Malcolm says, you're being tricked into thinking that America is going to help black people with these bills. That's just not true, right? And so Malcolm makes the case to, like, you know, and this is where the tragedy lies. Because Malcolm saw it, all he needed was one African state. One, not a majority, not 2/3, just one, to bring the case to the United Nations. That, hey, you know what? We want the case of black people in the United States to be part of an open discussion in the General Assembly as far as their treatment is concerned, just like black people in South Africa, right? Now, he had gotten, as he hinted here, not assurances, but from heads of state, right, kind of like inclinations that they were going to do that. Of course, he's shot down, he's gunned down within about 6 months of this interview, right? And we now know that the U.S. put pressure on these different governments of sanctions, of removing diplomatic and aid and whatnot, if they brought the case of the United Nations, to the United States to the United Nations. So Malcolm, it never came to fruition. It never happened, right? But that was Malcolm's hope. If the U.S. could be tried within an international forum like the United Nations, then maybe globally people could put sanctions on the United States, just like the United States put sanctions on other countries, just like sanctions were placed on South Africa. He was hoping to put sanctions on the United States for their treatment of black people, right? So countries would stop investing. They would stop having the United States invest in them. That was kind of the long-term hope. So that was a specific political project, right? But Malcolm, as we also come to find out also, was deeply invested in having Islam be a central part of the fabric of black people in America. So he organizes with Al-Azhar through funding from various different entities for young kids to go study in Egypt at Al-Azhar, to learn Islamic sciences and hadith and all this kinds of stuff, right? So Malcolm was working on multiple levels, right? And of course, we will never know. The bullets caught up to him, right? We'll never know what he would have, you know, kind of achieved. But as I talk about in my book, his influence has still, I mean, immediately the Black Panthers formed because of Malcolm X. Black Power, they say, our intellectual and theoretical architect is Malcolm. We are built in the tradition of Malcolm. Hip-hop comes and emerges because of Malcolm X, right? You know, and even, as I talk about in my book, at the highest levels of the U.S. government, when Feinstein is interviewing, when Feinstein is introducing Obama at his inauguration for the first time he was elected, she invokes Malcolm X. She says, those who doubt the supremacy of the ballot or the bullet can never diminish the nonviolent struggles that made this day possible. So she's elevating a certain image of King, and she says the ballot or the bullet, which is Malcolm's kind of iconic speech about black people should not vote. So Malcolm continues to emerge here. He's a continuing reminder. He continues to haunt, in many ways, the empire, right? And so we'll never know what he would have accomplished, but we can continue to see his influence. And I would say that when we think about how he saw American society, and even how King saw American society, because they saw it the exact same at the end of King's life, right? They were clairvoyant, right? They were prophetic in that sense, in terms of how they saw and where they saw American society going. Increased militarism, a wider gap between rich and poor, right? More wars being fought, right? And as John Legend pointed out last night, right? More black men are part of the carceral system than were slaves in 1850, right? The situation has gotten worse. So in many ways, you know, again, I don't want to put it back on these great men to have led us, and because they got killed now, we don't know what to do, right? We're all leaders, like Malcolm would say, right? Apathy isn't really apathy. Apathy is suspicion of your own power. It's not really apathy, it's just suspicion of your own power. You doubt yourself. You doubt yourself, right? Okay. Any other questions? Comments or clarity?
Comment?
Oh, go ahead, Marla. Sure. Speak up.
So you talked about linking global communities, but what about local communities in California, specifically like Muslim communities? So can you hear me?
Barely. So you started, just start again, Marla. You started with King.
So you talk about linking global communities, but what about local communities in California, specifically Muslim communities? There's racial segregation in our mosques. And like in my mosque, for example, they'll take blackness in doses of respectable and acceptable forms. So what are ways that you think we can deal with like our own, I guess, what?
Internal questions. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's a great question. I mean, I think this is why it's important to understand the history of not just Malcolm, but of black social movements in this country. Right? That's the model that we have to base our politics on. We don't replicate what they do. It's a different moment, it's a different time. There's different kinds of demands being asked for, right? But when it comes to those kinds of questions, I mean, I think again, we're talking about the largest group of Muslims in the country are black people. Why is it that we continue to kind of erase and silence them, right? And we only privilege a certain kind of black figure, right? Right? A certain kind of black imam or sheikh gets embraced. Right? That's something that we need to really think deeply about. Right? What kind of honorary whiteness are we seeking? What kind of acceptability and respectability politics are we seeking within our own minds? Right? And again, the fact that you can have a mosque in this country is because of the Nation of Islam. The fact that there's an MSA in universities across the country is because of the Nation of Islam. You have no idea how much you benefit from the work that the Nation of Islam did to make Islam seen as something acceptable within American society. Amongst black communities, to be a Muslim is not a strange thing. It's like, oh, everyone's got a cousin or somebody named somebody, a Shaquille or a Jamil or a, Sadiq or a, that's normal. But when you think about local, laws that were passed, for example, basic things, you might not think it's significant. In city jobs, for example, in Philadelphia, because of Muslims, you're allowed to have a beard if you're a public servant. Before that, you couldn't. You might think that's no big deal, right? But there's so many things you take for granted as Muslims that were laid down before you, right? So it's important to understand that history and pay homage to that, so that when it comes to specific kind of things that Mara was talking about, right? At a certain point, yes, elders, they're going to think how they think. Uncles and aunties can get a little rigid in their thinking, right? But you're the next generation of Muslims and Muslim leaders in the country. You're going to have your own messages. You're going to be part of them. You're going to have children. Right? We're still here at that time, right?